It's been about a year and a half, actually. I was thinking about it a bit ago, since I've actually been able to be up here and preach on a Sunday morning. And it's because David's out of town. So it's not like he gave it to me out of kindness, but convenience more so. Anyway, we're in the book of Habakkuk today. For the longest time, I've really wanted to do a lesson for you guys, or for anyone rather, about the book of Habakkuk. And this really came from my second year of college. I wrote a paper on Habakkuk, and within its pages, I found something really, really unique and something really, really interesting, which sometimes we get bogged down going through the prophets, and we totally forget about going through these smaller, minor prophets, and we miss out on some of these really amazing books. Now, Habakkuk is something that is super unique amongst the minor prophets even. It's something that, when I first read it, caused me to really think and caused me to really say, how have I missed out on this book for my entire life up until this point? Which is maybe not that long, but still, I had missed out on something amazing. And it truly reinforced the greatness of God's word to me. So you find, if you go to Habakkuk chapter 1, you see the character that is Habakkuk. If you want to look at like dates of Habakkuk, you really find the answer in chapter 1, as God makes a reference to the Babylonians and the rising up of the Babylonians. This places the book from somewhere from 625 BC to 605 BC, but is going to place it very close to the very first captivity, the Babylonian captivity of the people of Israel. Now, this whole entire book is designed in a kind of dialogue conversation back and forth. It echoes very similarly some elements of Job questioning and calling out to God. But it is super interesting when you build all of it together. And when we finally get to our scripture reading that was this morning, we reach this overall kind of beautiful ultimate statement that Habakkuk is going to make. But it kind of means nothing if you don't understand what is going on in the entirety of the rest of the book. So the book is designed like this. You have two separate dialogues that consist in this one, of where Habakkuk is going to ask a question of God. God's going to respond. Habakkuk will ask a second question. God will respond a second time. And then the third chapter is a prayer of praise about God that Habakkuk makes as a result of the answers that he receives to the questions. So let's look at Habakkuk's first question. This begins in verse 2 of chapter 1. It says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen? Or cry out to you about violence and you do not save? Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. This is why the law is ineffective and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous. Therefore justice comes out perverted." So Habakkuk is this Hebrew man, and he's looking out and he's seeing Israel, and he's seeing what's happening to Israel in this time. And what does he see? He sees wickedness, he sees injustice, he sees oppression, he sees violence, he sees conflict. And then ultimately he makes the final statement there in verse 4, justice is perverted. All kinds of wickedness and evil is rampant across all of Israel. And his question to God is, why? Why are you tolerating this wickedness in Israel? And it's a valid question. It really is. And one of the reasons why Habakkuk is so engaging is because Habakkuk asks this question. Why? Why do you allow this evil to exist? Especially in your holy nation of Israel. It makes absolutely zero sense to Habakkuk, and so he cries out and he asks God. So let's look at God's first answer. Beginning in verse 5, it says, "Look at the nations and observe. Be utterly astounded, for I'm doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it. Look, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open spaces to seize territories not its own." God says, don't worry, Habakkuk. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians. So don't worry, I'm raising up the Babylonians. And the Babylonians are going to get rid of all the wickedness and injustice that you see in Israel. I'm raising them up. They're going to do this. He then goes and describes kind of what this force is going to look like as it enters into Israel and the force that these Babylonians are bringing with it. Notice it says, in verse 7, they are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than wolves of the night. Their horsemen charge ahead. The horsemen come from distant lands. They fly like eagles, swooping to devour. All of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. They gather prisoners like sand. He said, there's a force coming, and it's coming hard. The fact that he noticed all these small pieces about the army, that their horses, their chariots, their warriors, they are all set in violence, but also, verse 9, their faces are set in determination. They are going to run you over, Israel. They are coming for you, and you will be utterly wiped out because the power and the force that's coming from these Babylonians. But notice two details here in his response because they're going to come up and be important. The first detail is in verse 7, where it says they're fierce and terrifying, but it also says their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. But then you jump all the way down to verse 11, and it says, then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They are guilty. Their strength is their God. Remember that. Remember those 2 points that God makes here, okay? Memorize those. We're coming back to it. They'll be important in a second, okay? So, essence. Israel, there's wickedness. Habakkuk sees the wickedness, cries out to God, why are you allowing this to happen? God says, don't worry, I'm raising up the Babylonians, and the Babylonians will get rid of the wickedness that you see in Israel. So Habakkuk hears this response. What does Habakkuk say? Habakkuk says, are you not from eternity, Lord my God, my Holy One? You will not die, Lord. You appointed them to execute judgment, my rock. You destined them to punish us. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you cannot tolerate wrongdoing. So why do you tolerate those who are treacherous? Why are you silent while one who is wicked swallows up one who is more righteous than himself? You've made mankind like the fish of the sea, like marine creatures that have no ruler. The Chaldeans pull them all up with a hook, catch them in their dragnet, and gather them in their fishing net. That is why they are glad and rejoice. That is why they sacrifice to their dragnet and burn incense to their fishing net. For by these things their portion is rich and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slaughter nations without mercy? Habakkuk says, God, you are great, you are awesome, you are powerful, and you picked them? Wait a minute, you're doing what? I can imagine the confusion that's coming here from Habakkuk, right? He's like, I just complained about treachery and evil and violence and wickedness. But you're picking those guys? Those guys? I was talking about Israel, but Israel's not even that bad, you know? Like, it was problematic, yeah, but those guys? I saw a comparison someone made one time where it was like, if you were flipping through a Where's Waldo book, I would put in a picture, but copyright. Israel would be like, okay, you have to hunt for Waldo, maybe like 5-10 minutes. You know, you'll find him. It's there. You'll definitely notice him. And then you flip the page to Babylon. Every single person in that picture is Waldo. That is the comparison he's making here. There's so much evil, there's so much wickedness within Babylon that it pales in comparison to what's happening in Israel. He's like, God, really? What are you doing here? It makes no sense. He says the very blessings that you give to people, they take those blessings that you give, those fish, the marine creatures that they catch. He uses this dragnet idea. And he says, when they cast out their nets, when they pull back in the fish, who do they thank? They thank the nets. They rejoice and sacrifice to the nets because it's their nets that they made that got the fish, right? This whole self-righteous, selfish idea that is representative. He's like, and compared to them, they're just going to slaughter us. compared to those guys, we're amazing. But why, when I complained about all this wickedness, you chose an even more wicked nation to punish that one? You can't tolerate wickedness. That's why I complained in the first place. What's the point of this? It doesn't make any sense. And you see, Habakkuk is kind of impatient here. So he says in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself in the lookout tower. I will watch to see what he will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. So he stations himself there, said, I'm listening, God. You got to give me an answer here. It makes no sense to me. Now, this, when those first two details come back in, right? And when you pair them, those two details we talked about with God's first response, when you pair them with his second response, it creates a holistic picture of what God is talking about here. All right, so chapter 2, verse 2 says, the Lord answered me, write down this vision, clearly inscribe it on tablets so that one may easily read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. He says, there's a vision for the appointed time, and that appointed time testifies, this vision does, about the end and will not lie. It's going to delay, but wait, because when it comes, it's not going to be late. So you notice here, he continues, verses 4 and 5. It says, look, his ego is inflated, talking about kind of Babylon as this whole entity, kingdom now. He is without integrity, but the righteous one will live by his faith. Moreover, wine betrays. An arrogant man is never at rest. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and like death, he is never satisfied. He gathers all the nations to himself. He collects all the people for himself. So he takes those two pieces. Remember, the views of justice and sovereignty are all stem from themselves from chapter 1. And then you also have, they are guilty. Their strength is their own God from the end of his first answer. And then you combine it with this statement about the vision and the statement that he makes about how their views are like death. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, this idea of death. Never satisfied, of constantly consuming. When you piece all those together, and then you throw his response right there in verse 2. So look how it unfolds. This vision is yet for the appointed time, but it testifies about what? It testifies about the end. The end of who? The end of Babylon. And so, God's response is basically the same as he said before, right? He just answers a different side of it, right? Habakkuk's first question, God, why are you letting this happen? God's answer, Babylon's coming. Habakkuk's question, why is Babylon coming? God says, they're still coming, but my judgment is also coming for them as well. It's just going to wait to when I need it to happen. And then he throws in the encouragement for Habakkuk in verse 4. He makes the comparison between Babylon and then those who are not Babylon, where it says, look, his ego is inflated. He's without integrity. But the righteous one will live by his faith. God's response to Habakkuk's second question is, Babylon's still coming. My will says that Babylon is the one who will punish the evil of Israel. But they're not exempt from the judgment. Just because I use them, just because I utilize them, doesn't mean I'm endorsing what they're doing. God's will rises nations up. He brings nations down, and it all happens in accordance with his will. And in this moment, he's raising up the Babylonians to punish the wickedness of his people. But he says, Habakkuk, this is happening, but have faith. Because if you are righteous, if you are the righteous one, that is what you live by. In order to live by faith, If you live by faith and you trust that the person you have faith in, the God you have faith in, is someone who loves, cares, shares, has given you new life. If you live by faith in that person, whatever he wills, it will be done. It reminds me of the Lord's Prayer, in which Jesus makes a statement in his prayer, "Thy kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Right? God's will is of utmost importance. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, whenever Jesus is about to die on the cross, he makes the statement, "Not my will, but your will be done." Now that is faith. That kind of faith can say, okay, there's someone coming who's much more evil than I am, but I know that God is doing this for a reason, to punish evil. And if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm trusting in my faith that the loving God who I've devoted my entire life to is doing it for a reason, and that reason is immensely critical to my life. God's got a reason, even if I don't understand and make sense of it. Now, if you continue through Habakkuk, what God continues to do here is he draws his illustration of Babylon and then he pulls it out and kind of, in essence, gives these kind of 5 pillars, so to speak, of what makes Babylon Babylon and the reasons why eventually Babylon will come to judgment. Because there's things that Babylon's doing clearly by Habakkuk's reaction that are deserving of judgment. He lists them as these 5 different woes. You'll notice all of these. You begin in verse 6 where it says, "They will say to him, woe to him who amasses what is not his. How much longer? And loads himself with goods taken in pledge. Once your creditors suddenly arise, and those who disturb you wake them, then you will become spoil for them. Since you have plundered many nations, all the people who remain will plunder you because of the human bloodshed and violence against lands, cities, and all who live in them. Woe to him who dishonestly makes wealth for his house, to place his nest on high, to escape the grasp of disaster." Jump down to verse 12. It says, "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with injustice." Verse 15. "Woe to him who gives his neighbors drink, pouring out your wrath and even making them drunk. You will be filled with disgrace instead of glory. You also drink and expose your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will cover your glory." And then verse 19, "Woe to him who says to wood, wake up, or to mute stone, come alive. Can it teach? Look, it may be plated with gold and silver, yet there is no breath in it at all." So the first 2, you have this sense of this kind of unjust kind of economic stuff, right? You have this kind of rampant greed as the first woe, like someone who just cannot, he just always has to consume, always has to have more. Then you have the second one, right? Dishonest wealth, scamming people, pulling these things away, extorting other people. Then third, you have slavery, complete throwing away of human life, extorting bloodshed, building cities on the back of this labor. 4, you have people who lead others into doing evil, right? Nakedness, drunkenness. These evil leaders who are drawing their people away from what is good. And then lastly, you have idolatry, those who devote their lives to worshiping nothingness, right? Now, what's really interesting is you look at these 5 pillars, you'll start to notice that these things are not solely unique to Babylon, right? You could probably go down the list of woes and find examples from our day and age in our country that echo these kind of patterns, right? You could find all 5 pillars in America. You could find all 5 pillars in every single country on earth. I could probably guarantee that. These woes are not unique to Babylon. In fact, you can kind of see the point that God's making here, right? Is that these things are the reason why Babylon is going to be judged. And if these woes exist not only in Babylon, but God's justice is coming at a certain time for every nation, for every people who practices these forms of injustice. So how much more so the idea of the righteous living by faith, that we know that God's got it. Even when we see things happening in our worlds, we know through faith that God's will has it under control. There are things that happen in each and every one of our lives. Personal things, confusion with politics, confusion with society in general, right? Time and time and time and time again, things happen in our lives, and we're just like Habakkuk, where we say, God, why is this evil happening? But God's response is the same today as it was to Habakkuk. Faith. Trust in me. I've got it. Now, what is Habakkuk's response when he hears this message? That the righteous shall live by faith. Well, that's what chapter 3 all is. It's broken down into this full kind of prayer poem as well. You can see in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, a prayer of the prophet Habakkuk. And so you see verse 2, he calls on the Lord. He says, Lord, I have heard the report about you. Lord, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. And then from verse 3 kind of down to verse 7, you see where God is coming. God comes from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His brilliance is like light. Rays are flashing from his hand. This is where his power is hidden. Plague goes before him, and pestilence follows in his steps. He stands and shakes the earth. He looks and startles the nations. The age-old mountains break apart. The ancient hills sink down. His pathways are ancient. And then in verses 8 through 15, he draws this image of a warrior, right? You'll see, are you angry at the rivers, Lord? This is verse 8. Is it your wrath against the rivers, or is it your fury against the sea when you ride on your horses? Your victorious chariot, you took the sheath from your bow. Your arrows are ready to be used with an oath. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains see you and shudder, and a downpour of water sweeps by. The deep roars with its voice and lifts its waves high. Verse 14, skipping ahead a little bit, it says, you pierce his head with his own spears. His warriors storm out to scatter us, gloating as if ready to secretly devour the weak. You tread the sea with your horses, stirring up vast water. So he creates this enormous prayer of praise about what? When God's judgment is going to come. What's really interesting here as well is that in verse 2, he says, come quickly, right? Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. Which, as a small aside, don't pray for wickedness not to stop. God's will be done, right? But still praying for it to happen soon, because we want that wickedness to be gone, is still an immensely encouraging thing. And you can see Habakkuk is doing that exact same practice. So the whole thing builds up. And so Habakkuk in this third chapter is rejoicing and praising the judgment that is going to come. And it finally locks in beginning in verse 16. It says, I heard and trembled within, my lips quivered at the sound. Rottenness entered my bones. I trembled where I stood. Now I must quietly wait for the day of distress to come against the people invading us. So he makes a statement about what's specifically going to happen to him and to Israel, right? But then he makes this immense statement, which in my opinion might be one of the greatest statements of faith in the entire Bible, in which he says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there's no fruit on the vines, Though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though the flocks disappear from the pen, and there are no herds in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord, my Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like those of a deer and enables me to walk on mountain heights. What's he talking about here? He says, the righteous will live by faith. I understand that now. And even when everything seems against me. What's a really fun detail here is he mentions both the fig tree and he mentions the olive branch. For Israelites, those are the most two core pieces of their entire food source and exports. That is the lifeblood of their society, literally. And he says, even if that's gone, even if the basic necessity of what it means to live is gone, even though I'm living by faith, I'm going to rejoice in my God, take comfort in my God, because I know, because of my faith, that He cares and loves me. Faith. If that's not faith, I don't know what is. Habakkuk, someone who doesn't even see, isn't able to see the entire full picture of Christianity, right? He doesn't even know who Jesus is. But he's able to say that even though everything in my life might be going in the opposite direction of what it feels like, if I feel like I'm falling apart, I've got faith, which means I've got God, which means I have everything I could possibly need. What's really cool is that this statement that the righteous will live by faith is also quoted in the New Testament a couple of times. As we wrap up here, I want to look at a couple of these verses. It's quoted specifically 3 times. The first one you find that I want to go to is in Galatians chapter 3. And this is specifically talking about kind of the law and how the law works together. But verse 11 says, "Now it's clear that no one is justified before God by the law, because" what? "The righteous will live by faith." Justification, it comes with your faith, right? And your faith causing you to make the decision to be baptized and then living by faith continually, right? You also go to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 36 through 39 says this: "For you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, the coming one will come and not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. And if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. But we," listen to this, "we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are saved." We don't need to draw back. Habakkuk doesn't need to draw back, right? He can stand firm, knowing that God's will is going to be done because of his restored faith that he has. God's got a plan. God's going to fix it. And lastly, you have Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Actually, in verse 17, we know verse 16 pretty well, right? Where it says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Greek." But right afterwards, he uses Habakkuk. It says, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." When you live by faith, you're not ashamed of the gospel. You're not ashamed of who you are as a Christian. You're not ashamed of Jesus. But the very essence of your life is all dedicated on the knowledge that He will love you continually and that your faith in Him will be rewarded constantly. It reminds me of another passage that Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Habakkuk can say this with confidence, where he says, "We know that all things work together for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose." Faith. It's everything. I know that probably through our Christian lives, you hear faith. You say, okay, I get it. I got to have faith. And time you hear faith. And sometimes it just becomes to a point where you get so dumbed down, you forget how important faith actually is. And then you read a statement like Habakkuk makes in chapter 3 about it. I could have everything going against me, but as long as I have faith, I don't need anything else. If Habakkuk can say that without Jesus, how much more so can we say it now that we know the Savior? So I ask you this morning, where's your faith at? It's a question you've probably heard thousands of times before, right? Where is your faith at? Because I'm going to be honest, God's will is marching along, right? God's will wants you to be there with Him as it's moving forward, right? God's will is going to rise up nations, bring down nations. God's will for your life is going to happen. It's just a matter of whether or not you're going to be there for the ride. Is your faith in a position where you can say, like Habakkuk, after just questioning something that you don't understand, when things seem like they're against you, when you cry out and say, God, there's so much wickedness that's happening in our world today. There's so much evil that's happening to me. I don't get it. Why? Why? God's response is have faith. And the question is, do you? And secondly, is your faith strong enough that when those questions do happen, are you ready for it? Is your faith strong enough to endure what's about to happen? Whether it has happened already, if it has happened already, there's more coming, I'm sorry to say. But the only way we get through life, the only way, is by finding ourselves and founding our lives on the pillar that is Jesus and faith and belief in Him and how that faith changes us fundamentally. If we don't have faith, we have nothing. And in the same vein, if we have faith, we have everything. So this morning, very simply, where's your faith? If there's any way we can help you answer that question this morning, please do so as we stand and as we sing.